Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, The House on the Seafront. Hercule Poirot, though he often proclaimed his distaste for the English weather, had allowed himself to be persuaded to a short holiday on the south coast. A London acquaintance had insisted that the sea air at the little town of Clifton-on-Sea was like a tonic to the system. Poirot, who mistrusted tonics in every form, had smiled indulgently but nevertheless agreed that a change of scene might serve his health, if not his appetite. Thus it was that he arrived one damp afternoon at Seaview House, a respectable guest house perched at the edge of the cliff road. It was not so much the sea that drew Poirot. He preferred calm waters in a teacup to tumultuous ones in nature, but rather the promise of quiet. After several taxing cases in London, he declared to himself that here, at last, he would have rest. Rest, however, has never been the constant companion of detectives, even retired ones. Seaview House was a solid Victorian building, painted white, its sash windows gleaming from recent polish. A brass nameplate shone by the door, declaring its respectability. Inside, the smell of beeswax and lavender polish greeted the visitor, along with the faint aroma of sea salt carried in on the draught. Mrs. Whitcomb, the proprietress, was a widow of sensible shoes and sharp eyes. She received Poirot with brisk courtesy, eyeing him with a mixture of curiosity and pride, as though having a famous Belgian detective under her roof added a certain luster to her establishment. She led him to a neat room overlooking the gardens at the back, declaring that the front rooms were already let to other guests. Poirot expressed himself satisfied, though he noted immediately that the wallpaper pattern did not match along the skirting board. "Attention to detail, madam," he murmured as she left the room. "It is always important, even for the walls." At 4:30 Poirot descended to the lounge for tea. The room was furnished with stout armchairs, a piano that no one played, and a great many framed photographs of ships at sea, all hung rather crookedly. A group of residents were already gathered, seated about small tables with cups and saucers, their voices pitched in a polite murmur proper to English boarding houses. Poirot, with his characteristic dignity, paused a moment on the threshold, taking in each face before he entered. He bowed slightly, smoothed his immaculate moustache, and moved forward to accept a cup of weak tea and a plate of currant buns. It is in such settings, modest and ordinary, that Hercule Poirot's genius thrived. For he did not look only with the eyes, but with the mind. He considered posture, tone, gesture. He watched how one hand trembled, how another gripped a spoon too tightly, how a third played with a ring as though in anxiety. By such small things he knew the inner lives of people. There were 6 fellow lodgers in residence. First among them was Mr. Henry Blakely, a retired solicitor, whose sparse grey hair and severe spectacles gave him the air of a man who had spent a lifetime with documents. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words came measured and exact, as though drafted before utterance. His back was straight, his manners formal, his teacup held between finger and thumb like a legal precedent. Poirot thought, here is a man who knows the weight of words, and who hides much behind silence. Next was Miss Lydia Crane, a thin and nervous spinster in her 40s, with a tendency to clutch her embroidery frame even during conversation. Her voice fluttered like the wings of a moth, and she laughed too quickly at small jokes. Poirot noticed that she glanced often at the door, as if expecting someone, or dreading their arrival. Captain Redfern could not have been more different, loud, jovial, and fond of recounting tales of the sea. His weather-beaten face, bristly moustache, and hearty laugh dominated the lounge. Yet Poirot observed that beneath the booming voice there was a restless tapping of fingers on the arm of his chair, as though his mind raced faster than his stories. Then there was Mrs. Irene Marbury, a woman of middle years, handsome in feature, with eyes that seemed to invite confidences. She listened with an intensity that was flattering, leaning forward at every remark, her lips parted as though she might whisper secrets at any moment. Poirot marked her as a collector, not of objects, but of information. The final pair were newlyweds, Mr. and Mrs. Allen, scarcely out of their 20s. They sat together, yet not quite with each other. The wife, fair-haired and delicate, gazed out at the rain-streaked window with a sigh. The husband, dark and restless, drummed his fingers on the saucer and corrected her every small remark with a sharpness that revealed impatience. Theirs, Poirot decided, was a honeymoon that had already soured. The tea passed with the usual banalities of English conversation, complaints about weather, remarks upon the freshness of the scones, comments on the shortage of sugar since the war. Poirot contributed little, preferring instead to observe, nodding gravely, raising his eyebrows at appropriate moments, and filing each gesture, each tone of voice, within the vaults of his memory. Later, when the company dispersed, Poirot lingered in the lounge, taking a second cup of chocolate, his indulgence, prepared especially for him by Mrs. Whitcomb, who already regarded him as a guest of distinction. He drew from his pocket a small notebook, its cover spotless, its pages lined with his delicate handwriting. He wrote not words but symbols, a code of his own devising, a triangle for suspicion, a circle for innocence, a line for doubt. Each guest received their mark. Poirot's little grey cells, though supposedly at rest, had already begun their labour. As twilight deepened and the lamps were lit, Poirot rose and moved to the bay window. The sea was grey, whipped into foam by the wind, the cliffs below dark with shadow. It was a view that inspired melancholy, yet also a certain drama. He folded his arms and reflected. Voila, he murmured to himself. Here we have gathered a small company, each with their secrets, each with their little anxieties. It is in such a house that human nature reveals itself most clearly. A microcosm of society, n'est-ce pas? And where human nature is, Hercule Poirot will always find, how do you say, the intrigue. At that very moment, a sudden crash sounded upstairs, the slam of a door, quickly followed by hurried footsteps along the corridor. Voices rose in agitation, then fell silent. Poirot's eyes glistened with interest. Rest, it seemed, might once again prove elusive. Chapter 2: A Visitor at Midnight. The second evening at Seaview House was unremarkable at first. The rain that had persisted throughout the day finally gave way to a pale sunset, casting a watery light over the sea. Guests took their supper in the dining room at 7, where a serviceable but uninspired meal of boiled fish and potatoes was served with due ceremony by Mrs. Whitcomb herself. Conversation was sparse, even Captain Redfern's booming voice seemed subdued by the dampness in the air. Poirot, seated between Miss Lydia Crane and Mrs. Marbury, made polite remarks about the quality of the bread rolls, though he ate sparingly. He noted how Mrs. Allen seemed listless, pushing her food about her plate, while her husband grew irritable and sharp. Blakely, the solicitor, consumed his fish methodically, bones removed with surgical precision. Miss Lydia chattered nervously about the weather, her hands fluttering about like pale birds. Mrs. Marbury leaned closer to Poirot, whispering little comments about the others with the air of one who enjoys stirring the pot. After supper, the guests retired as was customary, some to the lounge for tea or cards, others to their rooms. Poirot himself sat by the fire, sipping his customary chocolate, and listening to Captain Redfern narrate an improbable adventure involving pirates. The detective's eyelids drooped, but his ears remained sharp. He retired to bed shortly after 10, remarking that the English habit of early hours was one custom he found most agreeable. It was just before midnight when the tranquility of Seaview House was shattered. First came the barking of Mrs. Whitcomb's terrier, a sharp, insistent yapping that echoed along the corridors. Doors opened, footsteps shuffled, voices murmured in confusion. Poirot, instantly awake, rose from his bed, adjusted his dressing gown, and stepped into the corridor. His little figure, neat even in night attire, moved quietly but purposefully. At the far end of the passage, Mrs. Whitcomb appeared, candle in hand, her face pale with alarm. Several guests had already emerged. Miss Lydia clutched her shawl about her shoulders, eyes wide and fearful. Captain Redfern, in a rather flamboyant dressing gown, demanded to know what the devil was going on. The Allens peered from their doorway, the wife clearly frightened, the husband more irritated than alarmed. "It is nothing, surely," Mrs. Whitcomb said nervously. "Only that Rex has been disturbed." She gestured at the terrier, who continued to bark furiously, straining at the leash she had fastened to her wrist. "But disturbed by what, madam?" boomed Captain Redfern. "That is the question." At that moment a sound carried distinctly through the corridor, the unmistakable noise of a door closing softly, almost guiltily. All heads turned. For a brief instant silence hung, broken only by the dog's growl. Poirot raised a hand. "Messrs, mesdames, let us remain calm. Someone has walked the corridor, OUI. But for what purpose?" The guests exchanged uneasy glances. No one confessed to wandering. Mrs. Marbury, appearing elegant even in her dressing gown, murmured that she had heard footsteps earlier, moving quickly. She added in a lowered voice that she thought she had heard a knock, faint, hesitant, upon Mrs. Whitcomb's own door. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded, flustered. "Yes, it is true. There was a knock. I opened the door at once, but no one was there." Captain Redfern muttered about pranksters. Miss Lydia gave a nervous squeak and declared it was a burglar. Mr. Allen scoffed at the suggestion, remarking that any sensible thief would hardly choose a modest guesthouse as his target. His wife shushed him, glancing anxiously about. Poirot bent and examined the carpet where Mrs. Whitcomb indicated she had heard the knock. He passed a hand lightly across the surface. "It is freshly pressed," he murmured. "But the print, it is faint. A slipper, perhaps. Certainly not a heavy boot. Someone moved quietly, yes, but with caution." The dog barked again, straining towards the stairs. Poirot followed its direction, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Downwards," he said softly. Our midnight visitor descended. But whether he departed by the door or concealed himself below, that remains to be seen. The household descended in cautious procession, Captain Redfern leading with a candle like some comic crusader, Miss Lydia protesting that she would faint at any moment, and Mrs. Marbury whispering urgent questions to Mrs. Whitcomb. They found the front door securely locked, the windows fastened. The sitting room stood empty, save for the piano and its untuned keys. Nothing appeared disturbed. Mrs. Whitcomb, visibly shaken, declared that everyone should return to bed at once. "We must not make a fuss," she insisted. "It is nothing, only some draught, some trick of the house." But Poirot said nothing. His eyes had fallen upon the small writing desk near the window. The top lay open, and upon the blotter rested a single letter, unfolded. He glanced at it with apparent casualness, but his mind registered the details instantly: thick paper, foreign stamp, and a handwriting both angular and elegant. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed his glance and coloured faintly. She moved quickly to fold the letter away. "Merely some family matter," she said, too quickly. "Quite unimportant." Poirot bowed courteously, yet in his eyes there was a glimmer of curiosity. When at last the household returned upstairs, muttering and unsettled, Poirot remained for a moment longer in the lounge. He touched the edge of the desk delicately, noting the faint smudge where a hand had rested. The candlelight gleamed on his precise features. "A visitor at midnight," he murmured to himself. A letter upon a desk. A knock upon the door, but no one there. Mon ami Hastings, if only you were here! How you would exclaim at the mystery already present in this peaceful house. He extinguished the candle, ascended the stairs, and paused outside his room. From within, he could hear the restless mutterings of guests behind closed doors, the nervous cough of Blakely, the whispered quarrel of the Allens, the stifled sob of Miss Lydia. The house, though outwardly silent, seemed charged with unease, like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. Poirot smiled faintly to himself, adjusting his moustache with pride. "The play, it begins," he whispered. And with that, he retired, though sleep did not come easily. For in his mind he saw again the picture of that letter, lying open as though someone had read it in haste, and the sound of a door closing softly in the dark corridor. Chapter 3: The Gathering Shadows. The morning after the midnight disturbance dawned with deceptive brightness. The rain had cleared, leaving the sea sparkling and the air sharp with salt. From the breakfast room's wide window, the cliff seemed almost benevolent in the golden light. Yet the atmosphere within Seaview House was strained, for whispers of the night's events hung about the breakfast table like smoke. Poirot entered punctually, his attire as impeccable as if he were attending a diplomatic luncheon rather than consuming porridge and eggs in a seaside guest house. He greeted each guest courteously, noting with satisfaction the small signs of unease among them. Miss Lydia Crane's hands trembled so violently she could scarcely pour her tea. Captain Redfern attacked his bacon with unnecessary force. The Allens exchanged curt sentences, avoiding one another's gaze. Mrs. Marbury alone appeared composed, her smile gracious, though her eyes, Poirot observed, darted often towards Mrs. Whitcomb. It was Mrs. Whitcomb herself who looked most shaken. She sat at the head of the table, pouring coffee with an unsteady hand. "I feel I must apologize," she said in her firm but strained voice. "Last night was most upsetting for us all. I cannot think how such a disturbance occurred. The house is secure, I assure you." Yet someone walked the corridor, Captain Redfern rumbled. "That much we all heard. I'd wager it was some prowler who thought better of it when he found the doors locked." Miss Lydia gave a little shriek at the word prowler and dropped her spoon into her porridge. Poirot leaned forward soothingly. "Courage, mademoiselle," he said gently. "The presence of Hercule Poirot is in itself a guarantee of safety." This remark drew a faint smile from Mrs. Allen, though her husband rolled his eyes. Poirot, pretending not to notice, attended instead to his soft-boiled egg, which he tapped delicately with the precision of a surgeon. Yet breakfast did not pass without incident. When Miss Lydia reached for her embroidery bag, which she always carried like a talisman, she gave a startled cry. "My scissors," she exclaimed. "They are gone." She tipped out her threads and fabric, but the small steel scissors were nowhere to be found. "I had them last night, I was working in the lounge after supper. I swear I put them back." Captain Redfern laughed heartily. Perhaps our mysterious prowler was a seamstress in disguise. But his joke met with strained silence. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The disappearance of so small an object, it is never without significance, he thought. Later that morning, while strolling in the garden to enjoy the sunshine, Mrs. Whitcomb discovered the missing scissors lying on the gravel path beneath the rose bushes. They were damp with dew, as though they had been there for hours. Miss Lydia was both relieved and shaken, declaring in shrill tones that she had been the victim of some cruel joke. Poirot bent, picked up the scissors with his handkerchief, and examined them closely. A tiny smear of earth clung to the blades. He replaced them gravely in Miss Lydia's trembling hands. "It is curious, is it not?" he said softly. "That scissors so domestic should travel into the garden by themselves. One must ask, who had cause to borrow them, and for what purpose?" That afternoon brought another oddity. Captain Redfern returned from a walk and declared that his pocket watch was missing. He had left it, he insisted, upon his dressing table. A search of the lounge revealed it resting brazenly upon the breakfast table, as though displayed for all to see. "I'd stake my life I did not leave it there," the captain thundered. Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Then it was placed there, deliberately, perhaps?" The captain blustered, but his ruddy complexion deepened with more than mere annoyance. Mrs. Marbury, meanwhile, made a confidant of Poirot. Drawing him aside in the hallway, she lowered her voice. "Monsieur Poirot, I cannot help feeling something is very wrong in this house. I heard voices last night, raised voices, near the top of the stairs. It was late, after the disturbance, and I was too nervous to investigate. But I assure you, someone quarreled." Poirot bowed gravely. "And you cannot say who?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering. "No. But I think, though I may be mistaken, that Mr. Allen was one of them." Poirot inclined his head politely, but in his mind he noted both the statement and the woman who made it. Mrs. Marbury delighted in confidences, but she also delighted in drama. Her testimony, therefore, must be weighed with care. As the day wore on, the sense of unease grew. The guests lingered in the lounge rather than venturing into the town. Miss Lydia's nerves grew so acute she startled at every sound. The Allens quarrelled openly, their sharp voices audible through thin walls. Even Captain Redfern's bluster failed to conceal his restlessness. In the midst of it all, Poirot sat quietly, polishing his moustache and reflecting. He observed patterns, the way Mrs. Whitcomb avoided discussing her post, how Blakeley, usually so reticent, now studied Mrs. Whitcomb with a grave, searching gaze, how Mrs. Marbury's eyes sparkled whenever mischief was mentioned. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the sea turned dark beneath the cliffs, Poirot retired to the lounge alone. He arranged the cushions upon his chair with precision, seated himself, and considered aloud in a low murmur. First, a knock upon the door, but no one present. Then, the letter, read by eyes not meant for it. Now, objects displaced, scissors, a watch. Always it is the small things. Always the seemingly trivial. But to Hercule Poirot, they are the stepping stones to truth. He closed his eyes briefly. The air in the room was heavy with lavender polish and the faint smoke of the fire. In the distance, the sound of the sea against the rocks rose and fell like a whisper. Poirot opened his eyes once more and smiled faintly. It begins, this little drama. Shadows are gathering. Let us see which of our companions here is the author, and which merely the audience. Chapter 4, or the Vanishing Guest. The following morning broke clear and bright, though the sunshine seemed a poor disguise for the tension at Seaview House. The incident of misplaced objects and midnight wanderings had unsettled the guests, but now a heavier shadow descended. For at breakfast, a chair remained empty. Mrs. Whitcomb, presiding at the head of the table, frowned as she glanced down the line of places. "Mr. Blakeley has not come down," she observed. "That is unusual. He is always punctual." Poirot, delicately buttering his toast, lifted his eyes. "Perhaps Monsieur Blakeley overslept? Though I think, madam, that is not in his character." Captain Redfern guffawed. "Overslept? That one? Never. He's as regular as the tide. If he's not here, something's amiss." Miss Lydia gave a little gasp, her spoon clattering against her saucer. "Oh dear! Do you suppose he has been hurt?" Mrs. Marbury, calm as ever, sipped her tea. "Perhaps he took an early walk along the cliffs. The view is most beautiful at dawn." Mr. Allen gave a short laugh. "Beautiful, perhaps, but dangerous. Those paths are narrow. A man could slip easily enough." His wife paled and murmured, "Don't, Charles," in a voice that trembled. Poirot, observing each reaction, rose quietly. "If you will excuse me, Miss Amos, I will make the little inquiry. Monsieur Blakeley, he is not the man to change his habits without reason." Poirot ascended the stairs and tapped on Blakeley's door. Receiving no answer, he turned the handle. The room was neat, the bed slept in but now empty. Blakely's suitcase stood by the wardrobe, his clothing folded with meticulous precision. On the dressing table lay his spectacles, polished and ready for use. Poirot bent to examine them. He recalled Blakely rarely removed them, even when reading letters in the dim lounge. Most striking of all, the solicitor's walking stick was absent. Poirot stood very still, fingertips pressed together. A man of habit, yes, he murmured. And yet, he leaves behind the spectacles without which he sees nothing, and departs with only his stick? No, no, this does not accord. By mid-morning, when Blakely had not appeared, a search was organized. Captain Redfern led the way with boisterous determination, tramping the garden paths and calling the missing man's name. Miss Lydia fluttered about uselessly, wringing her hands. Mrs. Allen wept openly, declaring it was all too dreadful, while her husband snapped at her to be quiet. Poirot, refusing to be hurried, examined the details. He traced Blakely's last known movements. The solicitor had retired early the previous night, remarking upon the draught from the window. No one had seen him since. Poirot studied the carpet in the corridor outside Blakely's room, stooping to inspect faint impressions that others overlooked. Slippers, yes, he murmured. They pass this way. And then, he goes down. At noon the grim discovery came. A fisherman, walking the path below the cliffs, returned pale and shaken. He had found a body among the rocks. The company hurried down in a distressed procession, though Poirot went ahead with measured tread. They reached the spot where the waves lapped greedily at the stones, and there lay Mr. Blakely. His form was twisted, his features pale, his spectacles absent. The local constable soon arrived, summoned by a hurried message from Mrs. Whitcomb. He examined the scene with practiced indifference. Poor gentleman must have gone for a walk and lost his footing. Happens more often than you'd think. The verdict of accident was quickly assumed. Captain Redfern nodded, muttering about treacherous paths. Miss Lydia wailed that she would never again feel safe. Mrs. Marbury shook her head, declaring it all too tragic. Mr. Allen observed that Blakely had always been a solitary fellow, no doubt he had walked alone. But Poirot remained apart, gazing thoughtfully at the solicitor's shoes. He bent, brushed the sole with his fingertip, and frowned. "Curious," he said softly. "Very curious indeed." That evening, back at Seaview House, the household sat subdued. Mrs. Whitcomb spoke of writing to Blakely's relations. Miss Lydia embroidered feverishly, pricking her finger twice. Mrs. Marbury murmured of the uncertainty of life, her eyes keen as ever. The Allens quarrelled in whispers, their voices carrying through the quiet lounge. Poirot, seated by the fire, broke his silence at last. "Messrs, Mesdames, forgive me. But there is a thing which disturbs me. You say it is accident, that Monsieur Blakely walked alone and fell. Yet, his shoes, they are clean, spotless. To reach the cliff path, one must cross the wet grass. This morning, the grass was heavy with dew. Where then are the marks upon his soles?" The room fell still. Mrs. Whitcomb frowned. "But surely, Monsieur Poirot, he may have taken another way." Poirot shook his head gently. "None. Always lead across the grass. And again, the walking stick, it is absent. He never left the house without it, yet it was not found by his side. One must ask, was it taken from him? And further, without his spectacles, how could he walk safely in the night?" Miss Lydia gasped. "Then, you mean—" Poirot inclined his head gravely. "I mean, mademoiselle, that accident does not satisfy Hercule Poirot. There is here the hand of another." Mrs. Marbury raised her brows, leaning forward. "Murder, Monsieur Poirot? In this quiet house? Surely you exaggerate." "Madam," Poirot replied softly, "I never exaggerate. The little facts, they speak. And they tell me that Monsieur Blakeley did not fall, he was made to fall. A shudder passed through the company. Even Captain Redfern ceased his bluster and looked uneasy. Poirot smoothed his moustache with exquisite care. Rest assured, he continued, the truth, she will emerge. For the guilty one cannot forever conceal the hand. Already, the shadow of suspicion grows long. An Hercule Poirot, he watches. That night, as the house settled uneasily to rest, Poirot sat long in his chair, gazing into the dying fire. He reviewed each face, each gesture, each word. Blakeley, the silent man of law, had known something. Something that had threatened another. And for that knowledge, he had died. The sound of the waves below the cliffs carried faintly through the open window, steady and implacable. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The sea, she hides nothing, he murmured. Soon, neither shall the murderer. Chapter 5, Whispers and Suspicions. The day after Mr. Blakeley's tragic death, Seaview House seemed transformed. Its neat corridors and polished stair banisters were no longer merely the backdrop to genteel seaside life, but corridors of tension, echoing with suspicion. Guests spoke in hushed tones, glancing over shoulders as though a shadow followed close behind. Mrs. Whitcomb attempted to restore order with her usual briskness, instructing the maid to bring more coal to the lounge and arranging flowers in vases as though beauty could erase unease. Yet her hands trembled as she moved about, and once Poirot observed her pause at the desk, staring at the drawer where the mysterious inheritance letter had been kept. Captain Redfern, restless, paced the lounge, muttering about the incompetence of local constables. If this had happened aboard ship, he declared, we'd have had a confession within the hour. Men can't hide guilt at sea. His booming voice filled the room, but Poirot noted the quick flick of the captain's eyes toward each listener, gauging their response. Miss Lydia Crane sat near the fire, her embroidery untouched, staring at her lap. When spoken to, she startled as if awoken from a dream. At one point she whispered, quite without provocation, it might have been me. I rise in the night sometimes. I walk without knowing. I could have, oh, heavens! She buried her face in her hands. Poirot approached gently. Non, mademoiselle. One does not push a man from a cliff in one sleep. Put aside such thoughts. The guilt, it does not rest with you. Yet in his heart he wondered whether Lydia's confession revealed more than nerves. A guilty conscience often disguised itself as fear. Meanwhile, Mrs. Marbury played her part with elegance. She listened intently to every word spoken, drawing confidences from those who wavered. She assured Poirot in low tones that she was certain Blakeley had been in possession of some secret, something he had hinted at to her one evening by the fire. He told me, she said, lowering her voice still further, that there were matters in the house not as they seemed. And that he meant to speak with Mrs. Whitcomb about them. Poirot inclined his head, his eyes sharp. And did he say more? Mrs. Marbury smiled faintly. Only that certain papers might prove inconvenient. I assumed he spoke of his profession. He was a solicitor, after all. They love their papers. Poirot noted carefully the phrasing. Papers, inconvenient. And a letter in the desk, opened when it should have been private. His little grey cell stirred. The Allens provided another source of drama. In the mid-afternoon, their quarrel rose so loudly through the thin walls that several guests could not help but overhear. Mrs. Allen's voice, plaintive and tearful, "You are hiding something from me, Charles. I know it. You slip out at night, you refuse to explain." His reply, sharp and furious, "I owe you no explanations. You imagine ghosts in every shadow. Do not test me further." There was the sound of a door slammed, followed by silence. When later they appeared in the lounge, Mrs. Allen's eyes were red from weeping, while her husband busied himself with a newspaper, his jaw tight. Poirot, who had heard every word, made no comment, but tucked the knowledge away. A secret kept, a temper uncontrolled, these are dangerous things in such close company. That evening, when the guests had gathered once more in the lounge, Poirot drew them gently into conversation. He asked innocent-seeming questions, offering each an opportunity to reveal more than intended. "Captain Redfern, you take the walk upon the cliffs each morning, yes? Then you know every turn, every danger." The captain puffed out his chest. "Like the back of my hand. Could walk it blindfolded." Then, Poirot said softly, "You would know also where a man might stumble, where the edge is most treacherous." The captain faltered. "Well, yes, of course. But what are you implying, sir?" Poirot only smiled. To Miss Lydia he remarked, "You have the talent for embroidery, mademoiselle. Yet lately you prick your finger often. Is it that the hand shakes with fear, or is it another cause?" Miss Lydia blanched and stammered that she was nervous since the tragedy, nothing more. And to Mrs. Marbury he said, "A solicitor, he speaks to you of papers, of inconvenience. You think it idle talk. But you, madam, you are perceptive. Did you not ask yourself what papers, and why inconvenient?" Mrs. Marbury arched an elegant brow. "Naturally, I was curious." But Blakely was a man of reserve. I pressed him no further. Poirot bowed slightly. "But madam, you listen. Always you listen." Later, in private conversation with Mrs. Whitcomb, Poirot inquired delicately about the letter he had glimpsed upon her desk. The widow's face flushed crimson. "It is nothing of importance," she insisted. "A family matter only. I beg you not to concern yourself." "Pardon, madam," Poirot said gently, "but one who is discreet, he notices." The letter, it was disturbed that night. Someone read it, though it was not meant for their eyes. Such matters, they are not nothing. They are everything. Mrs. Whitcomb trembled. I do not wish to speak of it." "Not yet. Please, Monsieur Poirot, say nothing to the others." Poirot inclined his head gravely, but within him the conviction grew, the letter, the solicitor's knowledge, and his sudden death were bound together in a single chain. That night, Poirot took a solitary walk in the garden. The moon cast pale light upon the sea, and the sound of waves breaking upon the rocks carried up to the house. He reflected upon the day's events, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. "What have we?" he mused aloud. Objects moved, scissors, a watch. Voices raised in quarrel. A letter disturbed, a solicitor silenced. And each of our guests, how they betray themselves in the small things. The nervous hands of Mademoiselle Lydia, the watchful eyes of Madame Marbury, the temper of Monsieur Allen, the knowledge of Captain Redfern. All are pieces of the puzzle. But the pattern, it eludes me still. He paused, gazing towards the dark cliffs where Blakely had fallen. Yet always, the truth is in the details. It is there, waiting for Hercule Poirot to see it. And I shall see it. Back inside, the atmosphere remained taut. Miss Lydia retired early, clutching her embroidery bag like a shield. Captain Redfern poured himself a stiff drink. The Allens vanished to their room without speaking. Mrs. Marbury lingered by the fire, humming softly as she gazed into the flames. Poirot sat in silence, his eyes half closed. To the casual observer, he seemed to doze. But in truth, his mind was alert, piecing together every whisper, every look, every inconsistency. He was aware, more keenly than any of them, that within Seaview House the murderer still walked. And the murderer, he knew, would soon betray himself. Chapter 6, Poirot makes his arrangements. 2 days after the discovery of Mr. Blakely's body, the mood at Seaview House had shifted from sorrow to suspicion. Each guest, it seemed, had begun to look upon the others with narrowed eyes, as though the murderer might reveal himself at any moment. The once cordial air of a seaside guest house had curdled into mistrust. Poirot, however, appeared untroubled. He moved about with his usual precision, his shoes gleaming, his moustache immaculate, his manners as polite as ever. Yet beneath this surface serenity, his mind was busily weaving its net. On the morning in question, Poirot took breakfast in solitary dignity. He ate a boiled egg, rejecting 2 before he found one that met his standards, and afterwards requested a pot of hot chocolate. When Mrs. Whitcomb expressed surprise that he wished to remain at table long after the others had dispersed, Poirot merely smiled. "Madam, one must never hurry the digestion. Also, I find myself reflecting." Reflection, it is the friend of Hercule Poirot. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded vaguely and withdrew. Left alone, Poirot drew a small notebook from his pocket and began making tiny notations, initials, symbols, arrows connecting one name to another. To the untrained eye it would have appeared meaningless, but to Poirot it was the map of a labyrinth he intended soon to escape. That afternoon he walked into the village and paid a visit to the local constable. Constable Marsh was a broad man with ruddy cheeks, more accustomed to lost sheep and pilfered bicycles than matters of murder. He greeted Poirot with respect, though also with a shade of defensiveness. "You think it was no accident, sir?" Marsh asked, scratching his chin. "Well, I can't say as I've seen proof otherwise." "None, my friend," Poirot replied smoothly, "you have seen only what lies upon the surface. Hercule Poirot, he looks deeper. And what he sees is this: a man of habit leaves his spectacles behind, his shoes unstained by dew, his stick vanished, his death convenient to others. Is that accident? None. It is design." The constable shifted uneasily. "And you mean to prove it, I take it." "But naturally," Poirot said with a little smile. "For that, however, I require your cooperation. Tomorrow evening, you will join us at Seaview House. Sit quietly, observe. At the right moment, you will act." Marsh agreed, albeit with some hesitation, and Poirot departed, his steps light upon the cobbles. Back at Seaview House, Poirot set about his arrangements. He requested that Mrs. Whitcomb permit him the use of the lounge for a small gathering. "It will be," he explained with a twinkle, "a little entertainment. I shall exercise the grey cells for the amusement of our company." Mrs. Whitcomb, though puzzled, agreed. Poirot then made a careful circuit of the house, pausing in each guest's room with the pretext of admiration or polite inquiry. From Miss Lydia's he borrowed the embroidery scissors, promising to return them directly. From Captain Redfern's chamber he requested the loan of his much-discussed watch. From Mrs. Whitcomb herself he obtained, after delicate persuasion, the now-vanished inheritance letter which he had already discovered tucked behind the curtain in the lounge but wished to display openly. He placed each item upon a small table in the lounge, arranging them with almost ceremonial neatness, the scissors to the left, the watch in the center, the letter to the right. Each was polished and positioned so that the lamplight gleamed upon it. Poirot surveyed the display with satisfaction, his head cocked slightly to one side. "Yes," he murmured. "The stage, it is set. The actors, they will play their parts. And Hercule Poirot, he will direct." The guests, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless. Miss Lydia avoided everyone, keeping to her room for long hours, though she emerged at odd intervals with wild eyes. Captain Redfern blustered about leaving the guest house altogether, declaring that the air of suspicion was intolerable. Mr. Allen was seen pacing the garden paths alone, his face dark with thought, while his wife followed at a distance, wringing her hands. Mrs. Marbury alone seemed composed, almost amused, as if she relished the tension that gripped the household. Poirot, with his delicate courtesy, approached each in turn, inviting them to his gathering. To Captain Redfern he said, "You will come, mon capitaine? I promise it will not be dull." To Miss Lydia he spoke gently, "Courage, mademoiselle. You need not fear. It is only a small amusement." To the Allens he remarked, "Perhaps you will find, monsieur and madame, that clarity eases discord. The truth, it has the habit of calming tempers." And to Mrs. Marbury he added with a knowing smile, "You will not miss it, madam. You, above all, are curious." Each consented, though not without hesitation. As evening drew near, Poirot retreated to his room. There he polished his shoes, adjusted the crease of his trousers, and brushed his moustache until it gleamed like silver. He regarded himself in the mirror with approval. It is important, he told his reflection, that the detective, he presents himself not only as the mind supreme but also as the figure immaculate. One does not reveal the truth in disorder. At precisely 8 o'clock, Poirot descended to the lounge. The fire burned cheerfully in the grate, though the company was far from cheerful. They sat in silence, each watching the others with suspicion thinly veiled. Poirot entered with a little bow, his eyes bright. "Miss Amos," he said warmly, "I thank you for indulging me. This evening, I have prepared a demonstration, a game, if you will. We have had much tragedy, too much sadness. Let us now employ the little grey cells, not to lament, but to illuminate." He gestured towards the table with its array of objects. "Here we have 3 things most curious, a pair of scissors that travelled from a lady's work-bag into the garden, a watch that moved mysteriously from one chamber to the breakfast table, and a letter, most private, yet disturbed. Each, taken alone, seems trifling. Yet together, they tell a story." The guests leaned forward despite themselves. Mrs. Marbury's eyes gleamed, Captain Redfern scowled but listened, Miss Lydia clutched her shawl tightly, the Allens exchanged an uneasy glance. Poirot continued, his voice smooth and deliberate, "Tomorrow, Miss Amos, I shall reveal to you the full truth. But tonight, I prepare you. Tonight, I show you that in the smallest thing lies the greatest clue. Already, I know the guilty one. Already, the case, it is solved. But one must have the little patience, for the moment to strike, it must be chosen well." A silence followed. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, the sea beyond beat steadily against the cliffs. Poirot smiled, his moustache quivering with pride. "So, tomorrow evening, you will return here. And then Hercule Poirot will speak." He bowed and dismissed them. As the guests filed out, uneasy, Poirot remained alone, his eyes upon the 3 objects glinting in the lamplight. "The trap," he whispered softly, "is ready. Tomorrow, it springs." Chapter 7, The Trap Springs. The following evening dawned with a crimson sunset, the kind sailors say warns of storm. As the guests prepared for Poirot's promised gathering, a heaviness settled upon Seaview House. Conversation dwindled, even Captain Redfern, usually blustering, was subdued. At precisely 8 o'clock, Poirot entered the lounge, his appearance immaculate. His moustache gleamed, his patent leather shoes shone, and his eyes held a quiet fire. The table by the hearth had been set again with its 3 curious objects, Miss Lydia's scissors, Captain Redfern's watch, and Mrs. Whitcomb's letter. The guests assembled reluctantly. Mrs. Whitcomb took her seat with the air of a hostess clinging to dignity amidst chaos. Miss Lydia clutched her shawl tightly, her embroidery abandoned. Mrs. Allen's eyes were red from weeping, her husband kept to her side, his jaw set. Mrs. Marbury reclined gracefully, her lips curved in a faint smile, while Captain Redfern stood near the window, arms folded. Poirot bowed slightly. "Miss Amos, you honor me with your presence. Last night I promised you clarity. Tonight, I begin to fulfill that promise. He paused, allowing his words to settle. The fire crackled. Outside, the sea crashed faintly against the rocks. You see before you three things most trivial, Poirot continued, gesturing to the objects on the table. Yet they are not trivial at all. For each of them was taken from its rightful place and moved. Why? Because someone in this house sought to conceal his, or her, intent. Each movement, it was a shadow of a greater crime, the death of Monsieur Blakely. Mrs. Whitcomb gasped. Miss Lydia flinched. Even the imperturbable Mrs. Marbury arched a brow. Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but penetrating. First, the scissors. They vanish from the bag of Mademoiselle Lydia and appear in the garden. The lady believes she herself mislaid them, perhaps in one of her sleepwalking episodes. But I say, none. They were placed there deliberately, to create one impression. The shadow of guilt, it was made to fall upon her. Miss Lydia gave a low cry. I told you. I thought it might have been me. But you mean someone wanted it to look so? Precisely, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. Someone counted upon your weakness, your fear. That is cruelty and cunning. He turned to the second object. Next, the watch of Captain Redfern. It disappears from his chamber and reappears at the breakfast table. Again, it is a trick, an attempt to show disorder where none exists. For Captain Redfern is a man of habit. His watch, he guards it as he guards his ship. To misplace it? Impossible. Thus, another seed of confusion was sown. The captain flushed, his fists clenching. Then someone's been rifling through my room. By thunder, I'll not stand for it. Patience, mon capitaine, Poirot said smoothly. You shall have satisfaction. At last he placed his hand lightly upon the letter. And here, the inheritance letter of Madame Whitcomb. Private, yet disturbed. Ah, this is most telling. For what is an inheritance but the promise of money? And money, Miss Amos, it is often the heart of murder. Mrs. Whitcomb's hand shook. But surely, you don't mean someone killed poor Mr. Blakely over my affairs? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Madam, I mean that Mr. Blakely, being solicitor, knew more than he should. He spoke of a paper's inconvenient. He died before he could reveal them. Ask yourself, who benefits, if the truth he knew is silenced? The room fell into taut silence. Poirot let it breathe, watching each face in turn. Mrs. Allen gripped her husband's sleeve. Miss Lydia sat rigid, eyes wide. Mrs. Marbury studied Poirot with cool interest. Captain Redfern shifted restlessly. And Charles Allen scowled, his lips pressed thin. Poirot spread his hands. There, Miss Amos, is the stage. We have the objects moved, the fears awakened, the secrets half-spoken. And we have a man, Monsieur Blakely, who dies most suddenly. He did not fall by accident. He was pushed by one among us. A collective gasp broke from the group. Poirot continued, his tone calm though his words cut like a knife. The murderer is clever. He has sought to scatter suspicion. He has made use of small thefts, of planted evidence, of the anxieties of others. But cleverness, it is not enough. The truth, she has a way of showing herself. And tomorrow night, she shall be revealed in full. Mrs. Marbury leaned forward, her eyes glittering. Then you know, Monsieur Poirot? You already know. Poirot inclined his head. Oh, madam. The guilty one is as plain to me as the fire burning in that grate. Yet, there are formalities. One must allow the murderer to betray himself. Already, he is restless. Already, he makes mistakes. By tomorrow evening, the mask will fall. Captain Redfern broke in angrily. "This delay is madness. If you know the villain, name him at once." Poirot raised a hand. "Non, mon capitaine. To strike too soon is to strike without certainty for others. I must allow each of you to see, with your own eyes, what I have seen. Otherwise, it is only the word of Hercule Poirot. And Hercule Poirot, he desires justice, not mere belief." Mrs. Allen sobbed softly. Her husband muttered something about theatrics, though his face was pale. Miss Lydia whispered, "I cannot bear another night of this." Poirot regarded her kindly. "Courage, mademoiselle. One more night only. And then, all will be clear." The gathering broke up uneasily. The guests dispersed in silence, each retreating into their rooms. Poirot remained by the fire, his hands folded, his eyes half closed. When at last the room was empty save for him, the constable entered quietly from the side door, as arranged. "Well, sir?" Marsh asked. "Do you truly have your man?" Poirot smiled faintly. "My friend, I have had him since the morning I looked upon the shoes of Monsieur Blakely. But tonight, I have tightened the net. The guilty one, he feels the pressure. He cannot sleep. He wonders, what does Poirot know, what does he suspect? And tomorrow night, when the tension, she is unbearable, he will show himself." Marsh scratched his head. "You mean to provoke him?" Poirot twirled the tips of his moustache. "But naturally. Murder, it is a game of nerves. The guilty one trembles already. One more turn of the screw, and the truth, poof, she springs forth." He rose, straightening his tie. "Tomorrow, my friend, you will see the famous little grey cells at work. And tomorrow, we shall unmask the murderer of Monsieur Blakely." Outside, the sea roared against the cliffs, as though echoing the promise of revelation. Chapter 8, The Final Revelation. The following evening the guests assembled once more in the lounge at Seaview House. The atmosphere was electric, charged with dread and anticipation. Outside, the wind howled against the cliffs, the windows rattled in their frames. Within, the fire crackled brightly, but its warmth did little to ease the cold weight of fear. Mrs. Whitcomb sat stiffly, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. Miss Lydia clutched her shawl, pale and trembling. Captain Redfern loomed by the hearth, restless and impatient. Mr. Allen sat rigid, his wife beside him in quiet distress. Mrs. Marbury, elegant as ever, reclined with her usual composure, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. At the appointed hour, Poirot entered. His appearance was immaculate, his shoes shone, his tie was perfectly centered, his moustache curled with precision. He bowed slightly to the company, then took his place beside the small table where the scissors, the watch, and the inheritance letter were arranged. "Miss Amos," he began, his voice calm and commanding, "we come at last to the moment of truth. You have been patient, some of you less so than others, but tonight your patience is rewarded. Tonight, the murderer of Monsieur Blakely shall be revealed." The room held its breath. Poirot smoothed his moustache delicately. "First, let us clear away the shadows, the diversions. The little thefts of objects, the scissors, the watch, these were but tricks. Tricks designed to confuse, to suggest that disorder reigned in Seaview House. They served no purpose but to throw suspicion upon innocent shoulders. The scissors placed in the garden, they were meant to incriminate Mademoiselle Lydia, who already feared her midnight wanderings. The watch moved from Captain Redfern's chamber, it was intended to suggest his carelessness, his distraction. In truth, both were moved by the same hand, the hand of the murderer. Captain Redfern gave a grunt of satisfaction. Lydia gave a small, tearful gasp. Poirot raised a finger for silence. Next, the inheritance letter of Madame Whitcomb. This, I tell you, is the heart of the matter. For Monsieur Blakeley, as solicitor, knew its contents well. He knew, too, that its existence would bring temptation. That is why he spoke of papers inconvenient. Inconvenient, for whom? For the one who hoped to profit by its concealment. Mrs. Whitcomb trembled violently. But who would stoop to such wickedness, she whispered. Poirot's eyes glittered. We come to it, madam. But first, we must consider the circumstances of Blakeley's death. You recall, his spectacles were left upon the table, though he could not see without them. His shoes were spotless, though the grass was wet with dew. And his walking stick, that faithful companion, it vanished. Why? Because Monsieur Blakeley did not go walking of his own accord. He was lured. He was lured by one he trusted, led quietly to the cliff edge in the night, and there pushed to his death. Mrs. Allen let out a cry and clung to her husband's arm. He shook her off impatiently, his face pale but angry. Poirot went on, relentless. Now, who among us had reason to fear Monsieur Blakeley? Who knew that the solicitor held knowledge dangerous to them? Not Mademoiselle Lydia, for her only crime is a nervous imagination. Not Captain Redfern, who though brusque, has no concern with inheritances. Not Madame Marbury, who delights in observation but gains nothing from Blakeley's silence. Not Madame Whitcomb, who stands to inherit, yes, but why should she slay the very man who handled her affairs with loyalty? No, look closer. Look to the couple whose quarrels echo through this house. Look to the man whose temper is fierce, whose secrets weigh heavily. His gaze fixed upon Charles Allen. Monsieur Allen, it is you. There was a stunned silence. Mrs. Allen gave a strangled scream. Mr. Allen surged to his feet, his face mottled with fury. That's a damned lie. You've no proof. Poirot did not flinch. But yes, monsieur, I have proof. When I examined the body of Monsieur Blakeley, I observed a mark upon the sleeve, a smear of soil most particular. I searched, and I found the same soil upon your shoes, hidden beneath a hurried cleaning. The cliff path you knew well, for you walked it often in secret. Why? Because you were meeting with Blakeley. You tried to persuade him to suppress the inheritance letter. For with it, your wife would inherit in her own right, leaving you without control of her fortune. But Blakeley, he was a man of honor. He refused. And so, monsieur, you silenced him forever. Allen's fists clenched. You've concocted a tale out of nothing. Soil, letters, nonsense. Poirot's moustache twitched. Mais non, monsieur. Consider the walking stick of Monsieur Blakeley. It was missing from his side. This morning, I found it, concealed in the tool shed by the garden. Upon its handle, scratches, where it struck your coat as Blakeley clung to you in his final struggle. You hid it, thinking no one would look. But Poirot, he always looks. Mrs. Allen sobbed uncontrollably. Oh, Charles! Tell me it isn't true. Allen's face hardened. Be quiet, Margaret. He twists everything. Poirot raised a hand. Constable Marsh, he said quietly. The constable, who had sat silently in the corner throughout, stepped forward. I heard it all, Mr. Allen. You'd best come with me. Allen made a desperate movement toward the door, but the constable intercepted him. His shoulders slumped. For a moment his defiance flared, then collapsed into weary bitterness. Yes, he muttered. I killed him. The sanctimonious fool left me no choice. I begged him to help me, but he threatened to expose me instead. Do you think I could stand by and see my wife control everything while I had nothing? He forced my hand. Mrs. Allen gave a low moan and fainted in her chair. Miss Lydia shrieked. Captain Redfern muttered an oath. Mrs. Marbury, strangely serene, simply nodded, as though her curiosity had at last been satisfied. Poirot regarded the defeated man with sorrow. "Monsieur, you had a choice. Always one has the choice. Blakely chose honor. You chose murder. That is the difference between you." Alan was led away by the constable. The remaining guests sat stunned, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. Poirot, adjusting his cuffs, turned to them with grave courtesy. "Mesdames, messieurs, it is finished. Justice, she will take her course. The shadows have lifted. You may rest once more." Mrs. Whitcomb rose, her eyes brimming with tears. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "we owe you everything. Without you, we should never have known." Poirot bowed. "Madam, it is nothing. For me, it is always the same, the little details, they whisper the truth. One has only to listen." He straightened, smoothing his moustache with pride. "An Hercule Poirot, he always listens." The storm outside raged on, but within Seaview House, the darkness had been dispelled.